Good day, everyone. I'm Trisha Midi Cambarao, and the title of my paper is Marx's Theory of Alienation on Labeling Frontliners as Modern-Day Heroes. The current pandemic situation in the Philippines is far from recovery. Different types of quarantine protocols have been implemented by the government, from general community quarantine to an enhanced version of it and some quarantine with modified restrictions. However, despite these measures, there is still a relevant increase of COVID-19 cases in the country. As of September 17, there are 188,108 COVID-19 active cases, resulting in a total of 2,324,475 cases. That is why several organizations and the labor workforce have been protesting the government's incompetence in handling the pandemic. One of those greatly affected by the government's pandemic response would be the medical frontliners. Doctors and nurses have been asking for a timeout multiple times as their healthcare facilities have been overwhelmed. The PMA president, Dr. Jose Santiago, also stated that our healthcare workers can no longer bear the burden of deciding who lives and who dies. And with this, we could grasp how hard it is for the medical frontliners to continue working, knowing that aside from risking their lives, they themselves experience at firsthand the death of many Filipinos. So as a way of honoring the sacrifices and services of the medical frontliners, the government labeled them as the modern-day heroes during the celebration of National Heroes Day. So along with the recognition is a promise of boosting the government response. It is also their way of assuring the medical frontliners that their sacrifices and services would not be put in vain. One might ask if this recognition is enough for the frontliners to continue putting their lives at risk as they lead the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Thus, the paper claims that this form of government's recognition of the frontliners is an unjust treatment and a form of exploitation. I will defend this claim by first illustrating the situation of the medical frontliners along with the government's pandemic response. Then I will elucidate Karl Marx's theory of alienation, which would serve as my framework for criticizing the government's treatment of the medical frontliners. Third and last, I will contextualize the current situation of the frontliners to Marx's four forms of alienation. This would lead to the conclusion that medical frontliners, labeled as modern-day heroes, is a government's capitalization of their labor force. So, as stipulated in the Bayanihan 2, the medical frontliners are entitled to receive a monthly special risk allowance of 5,000 pesos. There is also a COVID-19 hazard pay that amounts to 500 pesos, which increased up to 3,000 pesos in Administrative Order number 35. However, months after these orders were approved, Jocelyn Andamo of the Philippine Nurses United stated that there is still a large portion of nurses that have not received any of the promised benefits. This shows the lack of urgency of the government agencies to facilitate the allocated budgets for the frontliners. Moreover, it is also the reason for medical frontliners to protest the government's negligence of the increasing COVID-19 cases and the unpaid benefits. Nico Oba, a frontliner, stated that they pitied themselves as they are the ones begging for the long overdue compensation. And there have been also called for the resignation of the Department of Health Secretary Francisco Duque for his incompetence in having a concrete plan and measures to combat COVID-19. So with this, presidential spokesperson Harry Roque stated that this group, they have never said anything good about government response, referring to the medical frontliners and addressed to the president of the Philippine College of Physicians, Dr. Marican Limpin. And this happened because of the call of having a hard lockdown or to implement a hard lockdown in Metro Manila as healthcare facilities are still overwhelmed with the surge of COVID-19 cases. And this act of Roque shows that medical frontliners should have been thankful for the government's efforts. As we can see, there is a mismatch between the government's pandemic response and the needs of the frontliners. And there are also a scarcity of personal protective equipment that makes the frontliners anxious about getting infected by the virus. Lack of human resources leads frontliners to cover shifts and work beyond their normal hours. Threats of mass resignation of health workers have also surfaced. Nurses are asked to work full 12 hours and to wear diapers to spare the hospitals from buying PPE. Considering Considering these situations of the frontliners as underpaid, overworked, undersupported, and disrespected, are they actually the modern day heroes that the government labeled them to be? So moving on to Marx's theory of alienation, according to Marx, human beings are creative beings and they could only be actualized through labor. Thus, labor serves as a self-expansion of a human being. For example, my profession is a writer. When I write, the literary piece is the expression of my potentiality of being a writer. With this statement of Onewuenyi, in this regard, it illustrates that labor is an essential element of humans and should not be seen only as a means of production. Labor enables humans to expand, assert, and extend themselves in a society. So, the essence of human being that is actualized through labor should not be estranged from the human being itself. Otherwise, it is what Marx calls an alienation of labor, where humans experience an estrangement of the self from themselves through the act of labor. Marx stated that the estrangement is manifested not only in the result, but in the act of production, within the producing activity itself. This is where he drew the four forms of alienation, which shows explanation of the working class by the capitalist class. So for Marx, alienation of labor only happens within the context of a capitalist society, whereas the capitalist class has the means of production and could exploit their workers to meet a certain quota of production. In the exploitation of the capitalists, it is where humans are alienated from their essence. Thus, they become slave of their production as well as of capitalist society. So here are the four forms of alienation. The first one is the laborer is alienated from their own product of labor. Humans feel that their work is forced upon them, such that in working, they do not feel happy and content. The workers in this form also realize that their production of labor is not theirs, but is controlled by the consumers. Based on Marx, the worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity. The passage illustrates the dehumanizing state of labor under a capitalist society. Instead of the product serving the worker to satisfy their needs, it turned the worker into being enslaved by their own product of labor. Thus, workers are serving the needs external to their needs, and consequently, they became a commodity. The next form of alienation is where the laborer is alienated from their own productive or life activity. As we are creative beings, according to Marx, ideally, we work to cultivate and enjoy our interests and capabilities. However, as stated in the first form, workers feel alienated from their product of labor as labor is forced upon them. The relation of the laborer towards their activity is now an alien activity not belonging to him. So instead of his productivity or one's productivity that is controlled by the worker and done out of interest, it is now controlled out of their necessity to survive under a capitalist society. Marx also stated that what is animal becomes human and what is human becomes animal. Therefore, humans only feel free when they do their animal functions like eating, drinking, and beating. Next is the third form of alienation, where the laborer is alienated from the essential nature of being human. It is where Marx gave a distinction that humans have their reasons to produce and are free to do so, unlike animals that are forced to do labor for their own needs. So in this sense, animals work to live while humans live to work. As Marx stated, for labor, life activity appears to man in the first place merely as a means of satisfying a need, the need to maintain physical existence. However, under a capitalist society, strange labor makes man's species life a means to his physical existence. So hence, humans are alienated from their own essence and are now forced to work to live. As humans were estranged from their product of labor, life activity, and essential nature, they are also going to be alienated from others. This is where conflict or competition also occurs, such that a human sees others as a threat to their ability to produce. So moving on to Marx's four forms of alienation on modern day heroes. Here, frontliners as modern day heroes have been experiencing challenges that dehumanize their own being. Reports such as lack of logical resources, funding, and urgency by the government have greatly affected the physical and mental well-being of the frontliners. As I've stated earlier, I illustrated the situations of modern day heroes. And I also left a question of whether they are really the modern day heroes, even though they are underpaid and overworked due to the government's failure to handle the pandemic. So I will address this question after I contextualize the situation of frontliners in the four forms of alienation. First, our medical frontliners are also alienated from their own product of labor. Here, the obligation to save lives has been greatly used to the advantage of the government. Nurses were forced to stay working in the Philippines after the government lifted the deployment ban on them. In this way, the government forces the medical frontliners to work and control their production. Since frontliners are forced to work, they see their product as something that makes them less of a human being. Their work is exploited by the government, but some cannot do anything as they are already enslaved by their product. As there is also an SRA and a COVID-19 hazard pay allotted to them if they reported their duty, it is expected that they would do so. This is the government's way to capitalize on their production of labor, which in return makes them a commodity. Next, the medical frontliners are also alienated from their own life activity as they have been covering shifts that are beyond their normal hours of work. Their productivity is not dictated by their own will, but according to their need to survive, as well as the needs external to them. Frontliners have been working out of their involuntary obligation, and in this way, they function the same as how animals function. Their life activity has become the same with the animals, which is to eat, drink, pee, and sleep. And these activities are still considered a luxury for some of the frontliners as they are working for a 24-hour shift in a week. Frontliners are also alienated from their essential nature of being humans. As I stated above or earlier, they are now functioning as animals as they repeat a cycle of work, eat, sleep for them to survive and make ends meet. It is where their passion to save lives through their labor is the same labor that made them alienated from their essence. Instead of their labor giving them the ability to self-cultivate and be a part of a societal development, they have been working to live. This is to provide for their needs under the capitalist government, even if the compensation given to them is undervalued and for some still unpaid. Their labor is considered a vital part of their existence, yet their very labor is a means of the government to exploit them. This is because the frontliners' production of labor, life activity, and essence are not out of their control anymore. Thus, the medical frontliners are also alienated from others. So in the fourth form, I would like to illustrate this as the alienation of medical frontliners from the government. The alienation here serves as a competition between frontliners and the government. This is where threats of mass resignations and protests of frontliners are explained as they do not receive what they deserve, such as just amount of salary and benefits. It is also where the frontliners' needs were unprovided by the government. So here, both parties see each other as rivals as the government thinks of itself as the ruling class, while treating the frontliners as the working class. It also explains why such government personnel think of themselves as someone that should be thanked and respected while their frontliners should remain inferior. So here, it is just another, it is these four forms of alienation used to analyze the underlying expectation of the government to the frontliners and justify that they are not the modern day heroes that they recognize them to be. It is just another way of government's expectation to make frontliners continue working and believe that they are doing all their best to make the frontliners' sacrifices worth it. Hence, it is unjust act of the government to label frontliners as modern day heroes as there is still no improvement in their pandemic response. Frontliners are also undercompensated and overworked. Many lives of frontliners have also been lost due to the government's incompetence. The act of the government lifting a deployment ban towards medical practitioners shows that they see medical practitioners as a commodity that they cannot afford to lose. To summarize, labor for Marx is a unique activity that human beings could do to self-cultivate in a society. However, in the case of the frontliners that are shown to be alienated from their production, life activity, and self and others, labor, according to their capability, would not be cultivated and instead would be exploited and pushed beyond their limits under a capitalist government. Thus, the paper argues that the act of labeling the frontliners as modern-day heroes is unjust as the government has not improved its pandemic response. Frontliners being uncompensated, underpaid, and undersupported while being overworked makes them alienated from their product, life activity, species being, and others. It is also what makes the frontliners exploited as the government continues to capitalize on their labor and treat them as a commodity.